After the victory of the Free Peoples in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the enemy retreated to Mordor. Sauron was defeated, but he still had thousands of orcs and evil men at his disposal in Mordor. He was aware that the One Ring was somewhat close to the vicinity of his territory, but he did not know that the Hobbit Frodo Baggins and his companion Samwise Gamgee had entered Mordor, via the pass of Cirith Ungol, with the intention of destroying the ring. After the last debate, the men of the West assembled the host of the West, 7,000 strong, led by Aragorn, who marched on the Black Gate as a diversionary feint to distract Sauron's attention from Frodo and Sam, who were carrying the One Ring through Mordor to be destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom. It was hoped that Sauron would think Aragorn had the ring and was now trying to use it to overthrow him in Mordor. Initially, the host of the West consisted of 7,000 men, but a strong force was left to guard the crossroads of the fallen king. Partway through Ithilien, the army was ambushed by orcs and Easterlings, but they were easily detected by the rangers of Ithilien and driven off with few casualties. Then, as the army approached Dagorlad, some of the farmers of Lossarnac and Rohan were too afraid to continue into the desolation of the Black Gate. Aragorn dismissed the faint-hearted, ordering them to liberate Caer Andris on the river Anduin, further reducing the strength of the army. Before the battle began, the Black Gate opened slightly, letting out a small embassy. At the head was a high servant of Sauron, a black Númenórean called the Mouth of Sauron, who had been ordered to speak with the captains of the West. He reasoned that the army of the West could not defeat Sauron's host on the battlefield, and demanded the army surrender. The lieutenant then brought forth several items that had belonged to Frodo and Sam, such as Sam's sword, an elven cloak, and Frodo's mithril coat. Gandalf asked for the terms of their surrender, which were to allow Sauron dominion over Isengard and Rohan, as well as Gundor's vassalage. Therefore Gandalf vehemently refused. Realizing the army intended to fight and being outnumbered, fear and anger overcame the lieutenant, and he retreated to the Black Gate, which then opened to reveal a massive army of Sauron's forces. Thousands of orcs also emerged from the hillsides around the Black Gate, and an Easterling force hidden behind Carchost emerged. Against the host of the West was arrayed large hordes of orcs, trolls, and Easterlings and Haradrim. An exact count of Sauron's host is not given, but it is said that they were 10 times and more than 10 times greater than the host of the West, making it a force of at least 60,000. Sauron's forces surrounded the army of the West entirely, circling around them to prevent any escape. Initially, Sauron's forces found difficulty in getting to the army of the West, due to the large slag pools and pits of waste surrounding parts of the Black Gate, which impeded their progress. This gave Aragorn time to prepare his forces, splitting them between two slag hills. The troops positioned themselves in defense rings on each of the two hills. On each of hills stood a force comprised of Eomer, Imrahil, and personnel of the Tower Guard on the right, and a force comprised of Gandalf, Aragorn, the sons of Elrond, and the Rangers of the North on the left. The wind blew, and the trumpets sang, and arrows whined, but the sun now climbing towards the south was veiled in the reeks of Mordor, and through a threatening haze it gleamed, remote, a sullen red, as if it were the ending of the day, or the end maybe of all the world of light. And out of the gathering murk the Nazgûl came with their cold voices crying words of death, and then all hope was quenched. Pippin had bowed crushed with horror when he heard Gandalf reject the terms, and doom Frodo to the torment of the tower, but he had mastered himself, and now he stood beside Baragond, in the front rank of Gondor with Imrahil's men. For it seemed best to him to die soon and leave the bitter story of his life, since all was in ruin. He drew his sword and looked at it, and the intertwining shapes of red and gold, and the flowing characters of Númenor glinted like fire upon the blade. This was made for just such an hour, he thought. Then even as he thought these things, the first assault crashed into them. The orcs, hindered by the mires that lay before the hills, halted, and poured their arrows into the defending ranks. But through them there came striding up, roaring like beasts, a great company of hill trolls out of Gorgoroth. Taller and broader than men they were, and they were clad only in close-fitting mesh of horny scales, or maybe that was their hideous hide, but they bore round bucklers, huge and black, and wielded heavy hammers in their knotted hands. Reckless, they sprang into the pools and waded across, bellowing as they came. Like a storm, they broke upon the line of the men of Gondor, and beat upon helm and head, and arm and shield, as smiths hewing the hot bending iron. At Pippin's side Baragon was stunned and overborne, and he fell, and the great troll chief that smote him down bent over him, reaching out a clutching claw, for these fell creatures would bite the throats of those that they threw down. Then Pippin stabbed upwards, and the written blade pierced through the hide and went deep into the vitals of the troll, and his black blood came gushing out. He toppled forward and came crashing down like a falling rock, burying those beneath him. Blackness and stench and crushing pain came upon Pippin, and his mind fell away into a great darkness, and his thought fled far away and his eyes saw no more. All about the hills the hosts of Mordor raged. The captains of the west were foundering in a gathering sea. The sun gleamed red, and under the wings of the Nazgul, the shadows of death fell dark upon the earth. Aragorn stood beneath his banner, silent and stern, as one lost in thought of things long past or far away, but his eyes gleamed like stars that shine the brighter as the night deepens. Upon the hilltop stood Gandalf, and he was white and cold and no shadow fell on him. The onslaught of Mordor broke like a wave on the beleaguered hills, voices roaring like a tide amid the wreck and crash of arms. As if to his eyes some sudden vision had been given, Gandalf stirred, and he turned, looking back north where the skies were pale and clear. Then he lifted up his hands and cried in a loud voice ringing above the din, "The eagles are coming!" And many voices answered crying, "The eagles are coming!" Then the hosts of Mordor looked up and wondered what this sign might mean. There came the great eagles of the misty mountains, led by Gwyar the Windlord, arrived and attacked the ringwraiths, preventing them from pressing their aerial advantage. But the Nazgul turned and fled, and vanished into Mordor's shadows, hearing a sudden terrible call out of the Dark Tower to intercept Frodo, and even at that moment all the hosts of Mordor trembled, doubt clutched their hearts, their laughter failed, their hands shook and their limbs were loosed. Then all the captains of the west cried aloud, for their hearts were filled with a new hope in the midst of darkness. Out from the beleaguered hills, knights of Gondor, riders of Rohan, Dúnedain of the north, drove against their wavering foes, piercing the press with the thrust of bitter spears. But Gandalf lifted up his arms and called once more in a clear voice, "Stand, men of the west! Stand and wait! This is the hour of doom." And even as he spoke, the earth rocked beneath their feet. Then rising swiftly up, far above the towers of the Black Gate, high above the mountains, a vast soaring darkness sprang into the sky, flickering with fire. The earth groaned and quaked. The towers of the Teeth swayed, tottered, and fell down, the mighty rampart crumbled, the Black Gate was hurled in ruin. "The realm of Sauron is ended," said Gandalf. "The ring-bearer has fulfilled his quest." At this moment, the orcs and other creatures of Sauron at the battle scattered in disarray, and were routed by the host of the west, or fled. Seeing the power of Mordor collapse, the Easterling and Southron saw the ruin of their war, and the great majesty and glory of the captains of the west. And those that were deepest and longest in evil servitude, hating the west, and yet were men proud and bold, in their turn now gathered themselves for a last stand of desperate battle. But the most part fled eastward as they could, and some cast their weapons down and sued for mercy. Despite the destruction of Mordor and its armies, the fight against Sauron's remaining forces continued in the northern theater of the War of the Ring for several weeks, notably at Dol Guldur in Mirkwood and at the Lonely Mountain. With Sauron's power vanquished, his forces lost these battles. Orc strongholds also remained in Mordor and, immediately after the battle, Aragorn led a force into Mordor to destroy them. Months later, the Battle of Bywater in the Shire against Ruffians led by Saruman, and the subsequent killing of Saruman by Wormtongue, ended the War of the Ring. The War of the Ring had great influence on all of the lands of the northwest of Middle-earth. Most importantly, it led to the restoration of the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor as the reunited kingdom, under King Elessar. The steward of Gondor was dead, but he was succeeded by his son Faramir, who kept the office, and was given the title Prince of Ithilien. In Rohan the heir apparent, Theodred, was killed, and, in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, King Theoden died as well. He was succeeded by his nephew Eomer. In the glittering caves at the Hornburg, a dwarven colony was established, and Isengard was given to the Ents, who filled Saruman's pits and reforested the land, renaming it the Treegarth of Orthanc. In Dale, both King Bran and King Dain II were killed, who were succeeded by their sons Bard II and Thorin III. They sent their emissaries to the crowning of Elisar, and were in alliance with Gondor until their kingdoms ended. For the elves, the final decline had begun. With the destruction of the One Ring, the power of the Three Rings faded, and the kingdoms that had been preserved by their magic began to fade with them.